Okay, welcome back from the coffee break, and we'll kick off with our second session, which is called Too Much Information, and two presenters today. The first will be Fiona Johnson, who is a health psychologist from UCL, working in a research group that focused on appetite, weight, obesity. So Fiona will start first, and we'll follow the same format with a few questions after. And then second, we have Professor Matthew Hotoff, again from the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology, and Neuroscience, who's going to be talking about big data. So Fiona is going to kick off. So, yeah, you have to put this.
Okay, well, it's very nice to be here and see you all today. I'm Fiona Johnson from UCL, and following on from what was quite an philosophical and neuroscience introduction to the topic, my background is more in health psychology and epidemiology. And what I want to talk about today is the question of how well people are able to recognise their own weight. And also, what are the implications of that recognition where it occurs? And I just want to finish off as well by raising one question of a topic which I think might be important for reducing the amount of stigma attached to overweight for those people who experience it. Okay, so just a bit of background on obesity first. We know that it's a global concern, so across the world, substantial numbers of Western countries have a prevalence of obesity in excess of 30% of the population. It affects Western countries and also middle-income countries, and even in developing countries, as people's eating patterns are moving over from more traditional eating styles to a Western diet, then obesity begins to increase. If we look at the data from England, this is data from the Health Survey for England, and it shows the extent of the obesity epidemic in England, data from 2014. And at this time, a quarter of adults fell into the category that would be termed obese, and an additional third of adults were overweight. Among children, prevalence of normal weight was greater, but there were still substantial numbers of children who are overweight and obese. We know that the prevalence of obesity is increasing over time. And again, this is more data from the Health Survey for England. And it shows that the prevalence of excess weight, that is, overweight including obesity, rose substantially up to about 2002. But it's remained fairly stable since then for both men and women. You can see that excess weight is higher among women. But if we look at the trends for severe obesity among adults, firstly, women have higher prevalence than men, and there's no sign of that increase slowing down over time. We know that obesity has severe consequences for health. It's strongly associated with type 2 diabetes. It's a major risk factor for several types of cancer, including some of the most common cancers like colorectal and breast cancer. It's also a strong predictor of cardiovascular disease, so heart disease and stroke, and it's associated with osteoarthritis and other musculoskeletal disorders. And most of these ill effects have a graded association with weight, so the higher your BMI, the greater your risk. We also know that obesity is harmful to people's well-being. Obese people face multiple forms of prejudice and stigma, and weight bias is quite persistent in employment, in healthcare, and also in interpersonal relationships. We know that obese children and adults report lower quality of life. They report poorer psychological health and well-being. And there are also a range of social and economic costs of obesity, which include the fact that obese people are more likely to be unemployed, they experience more poverty, they have higher hospital admissions and increased sick leave, and these burdens are borne both by the individual and by society. And at the same time, all of these issues coexist with a society that's quite obsessed with appearance and where thinness is idolised. And there's been huge concern about the effects of excessive weight concern on particularly young people. We know that people who are excessively preoccupied with their weight suffer from low body weight esteem. They have psychological distress issues, including high levels of anxiety and depression. Preoccupation with weight is also associated with extreme or inappropriate dieting practices. And fundamentally, it produces the risk of eating disorders. Now, eating disorders are not an inevitable or even a particularly common consequence of weight preoccupation, but in the most extreme form, they can be deadly. And anorexia nervosa has one of the highest death rates of any psychological disorders. And poor body image is a central feature of all the major eating disorders. So the public health challenge seems to be to find ways of encouraging and supporting people to achieve and maintain a healthy weight and a healthy diet while avoiding increasing their body weight distress and preventing them developing unhealthy preoccupations with their weight that could precede the development of eating disorders. So how does self-awareness fit into this picture? Well, an awareness of one's own body weight and weight status has been assumed to be a necessary first step towards undertaking the kind of actions which are going to be necessary to control your weight. And it has been believed that individuals who are overweight need to recognise that they have a problem. And it's become apparent that weight perceptions in the population are very discrepant from definitions that would be used by health professionals. Now, the standard way of classifying weight is using the body mass index, which is a measure of weight adjusted for height, and which is a very useful tool to use across populations. When it's used in relation to individuals, it's a slightly cruder measure, but still a useful rule of thumb for indicating what an individual's likely health risks are associated with their weight. So, over the last almost 20 years now, the unit that I work with has been monitoring weight perceptions in the UK in terms of how far people recognise that they are overweight if they are, or whether their definitions correspond to the definitions of clinicians. And this is data from a representative sample of 2,000 British adults that carried out in 2012. Participants were asked to provide their height and weight, so it was self-reported height and weight, and to say whether they thought their body weight was underweight, normal weight, overweight, or obese. And if you look at each weight category in turn, you can see that more than half of those who are underweight felt that they were about right. So there's a substantial amount of overestimation of weight there. The large majority of normal weight people identified that they were about right. Among those who were overweight, around 40% felt that they were about right. So that's 4 in 10 people who are overweight actually not recognising that their weight may be a problem. And the data that concerned us the most was from the obese people in the sample, among whom less than 3 in 10 identified themselves as being very overweight or obese. And these are people whose weight is high enough to be a substantial risk to their health. So altogether, 9% of the population overestimated their weight. That is, they felt that they were fatter than a clinical definition would term them, and 30% underestimated. We've also found similar patterns of misperception in adolescents. So this is a paper which was a study of normal weight adolescents. It was actually a reanalysis of Health Survey for England data. The adolescents were aged between 13 and 15 years, and this time measured weights were used rather than self-reported. And among adolescents, 84% of those who were normal weight realised they were about the right weight, and only 7% thought they were too heavy. Among overweight and obese adolescents, 60% recognised they were too heavy, and 39% underestimated their weight, basically describing themselves as about the right weight. So why do people fail to accurately report their weight status? Well, a large number of explanations have been suggested. One of the most prominent ways of looking at this has been to consider social norms. So we know that when people are making judgments, they're highly reliant on heuristics, that is shortcuts or rules of thumb for making judgments. And this perspective would claim that people actually do not know what a healthy weight looks like. And as the population has become larger over the last 20 years, the perception of what constitutes the right weight to be may have changed as people compare themselves to others. And a larger body weight gradually becomes the norm. So this is supported by the development of weight perceptions between 1999 and 2007. So what we see here is that over a period when the prevalence of overweight and obesity was strongly increasing in the population, the blue line indicates the number of people who are overweight who identify themselves as overweight. And you can see that between 1999 and 2007, that proportion decreases dramatically. And this perspective is also supported by experimental studies. So in this study, participants were shown images of either obese or normal weight people before being asked to rate an image of a mildly overweight young man on the basis of whether he was a healthy weight and whether he was heavier than most young men. And exposure to images of obese people led participants to rate him as both healthier and thinner in relation to his peers, which supports the idea of social norms having an influence. A second explanation for poor weight perceptions has been focused on media representations of obesity. So the typical images used in media stories about obesity, they generally show people who are at the extreme end of the weight spectrum. They're people who are morbidly obese. Typically they're depicted inactive and often eating. And they're also often headless, which, although it's obviously the aim is to preserve people's anonymity, it actually has quite a dehumanizing effect. And these pictures are fairly stigmatizing. And they give the impression of obesity as being quite an extreme state and not something that many people would identify with. And it's very possible that the exposure to these images gives people a false impression of what obesity looks like. And then there's a third explanation which is very interesting, and it focuses on self-presentation strategy and the protection of self-esteem. So it could be considered that perceiving oneself to be overweight is threatening to self-esteem. And claiming a socially acceptable weight status might be a positive illusion that's psychologically protective and reflects a positive and optimistic view of the self. And this distortion in how people report their weight could be motivated either by a desire to present themselves well to others, or by a desire to present themselves well to themselves and have a positive evaluation of themselves. And these kind of positive illusions are a robust psychological phenomena, whereby people make more favourable estimates of their own risks, capabilities and characteristics. So, for example, a classic example of this is that the vast majority of people claim that they are a better than average driver. So, does it matter if people misperceive their weight? Well, it's long been assumed that recognition of overweight is a prerequisite for taking action. And in the last few years, given the amount of concern about increasing levels of misperception of body weight, a body of research has been published which looks at longitudinal outcomes for people, or particularly overweight or obese people, who accurately or inaccurately perceive their weight. And this has shown that people who have an accurate perception of their weight, i.e. they recognise that they're overweight or obese, have greater levels of body weight dissatisfaction. They have a greater desire and intention to lose weight. The evidence on how misperception relates to eating behaviour, health behaviours and exercise has been more inconsistent, with some studies finding that people who misperceive have better health behaviours and others finding the reverse. It's also been found that people who perceive their weight accurately have a lower health-related quality of life. And most importantly and most startlingly, it's been established that people who accurately perceive their weight have poorer weight control over time. So those who recognise they're overweight or obese gain more weight than those who do not. And this seems counterintuitive, but it is a very robust finding, and it's been replicated in several longitudinal data sets from several countries. So this is one of the studies which came out recently looking at this question, and it showed that the effect was not due to differences in initial BMI of the participants. It's statistically controlled for many other potentially confounding factors, so it controlled for age, it controlled for socioeconomic status and initial health status. And the effect was still very strong. And the authors of this paper said, "We found consistent evidence that perceiving oneself as being overweight was associated with increased weight gain." So how can this be explained? Well, the authors of that paper attributed it to the distress that's associated with the recognition of overweight. And they said, the stigma of adiposity in modern society could promote maladaptive coping responses, for example, stress-induced overeating among self-perceived overweight individuals. And indeed, there is an emerging body of evidence to suggest that when people's feelings of weight stigma are elicited in an experimental setting, this can promote overeating amongst people who are most vulnerable. So, what do we know about these people who are overweight and recognise that they're overweight? These people become an interesting group at this point because they're the people who seem to have the worst outcomes. Well, we know that in a society where fat is very stigmatised and where leanness is lauded, and where many of the people around them are living in blissful ignorance or perhaps willful ignorance of their weight, they are the people who are evaluating themselves negatively and may well be assuming that others are doing the same. And they seem to be resistant to the positive illusions that many other people have. And as I mentioned earlier, there is substantial evidence that positive illusions are beneficial. So people who have high levels of unrealistic optimism also show higher levels of positivity. They have lower anxiety and depression. these kind of positive illusions are associated with goal persistence and hopefulness. And it's also been stated that they're likely to be beneficial to people who are actively coping with a problem. And in the light of this, it seems less surprising that people who recognise they're overweight are struggling more with their weight over time. And so, what can we take away from this? Well, it seems to be that the easiest and simplest conclusion to draw is that feeling bad is bad for you. It's bad for your self-worth, it's bad for your motivation, it's bad for your behaviour, and it's bad for your health. So, given this, how should we be responding? After all, the people that we're talking about are still at risk of all the health problems that we discussed earlier. They are still at risk of experiencing stigma and discrimination. And many of them also, even if they don't term themselves as overweight, would like to lose weight and recognise it would have benefits for them. Well, there's one thing that I would like to raise as a possible contributor to improving attitudes towards weight and overweight and the stigma of weight in society, and that is to challenge stigma by promoting greater understanding of the causes of weight gain. So researchers in eating behaviour and appetite have a much better understanding of how genes and environment combine to determine an individual's susceptibility to weight gain. And these understanding of these interactions has taken huge strides forward in the last decade. But this hasn't corresponded to a wide understanding of the causes of overweight in the general population. So this is data from a recent population study which established that only 45% of British adults thought that genes were a cause of overweight, and 57% endorsed the statement, being overweight is mainly the person's own fault. But we know that environmental changes account for the dramatic increases in the weight profile of the population. So there are multiple aspects of the food environment that contribute to increasing people's appetite and stimulating them to eat. These include a food supply that's plentiful, highly palatable, and energy dense, highly calorific. We have pretty much constant access to food at all times of the day and night. It's served in large portions, it's inexpensive, and our diets are very varied. And all these things are well established as things that stimulate appetite and encourage overeating. But we also know that these things don't affect everyone equally. People vary in their responsiveness to the food environment and in their sensitivity to internal signals telling them to eat. Estimates of the contribution of genes to obesity, which have been largely based on twin and adoption studies, have estimated that across the life course, genes account for between 50 and 90% of variation between people in body weight. And these genetic differences can be observed in biological correlates, so they can be measured in terms of brain activity and gut hormones. But these factors which contribute to a person becoming overweight are not well understood, and as a contributor to allowing people to be willing to observe their own weight without feeling judgmental about it, I think that these could make a contribution to that. We know that there's no level playing field when it comes to weight. Some people will always have more of a struggle than others. And in that context, there's no place for stigma. And I would just like to suggest that if we could manage to communicate this more effectively, it might be the case that people were firstly more willing to look in the mirror, and secondly, less likely to be distressed by what they see there. Okay, that's it.
Okay, well, thank you, Fiona. We're going to have to use the roaming mic again, and questions. So first up, Matthew.
Thanks, Matthew Hodoff. So the effect of knowing that you're overweight, increasing your chances of putting on weight, seems really interesting and important. And of course, you know, if you've got a primary school aged child, what they're being done now is weighing them and giving parents feedback. And is there any evidence, has that been appraised or assessed? And is there any evidence that it's actually having the impact in the direction you'd expect from what you've presented?
I mean, this really is very new findings. Until sort of 18 months ago, it was entirely assumed that it was a good thing to tell people what their weight is. And I'm very reluctant to say it's not a good thing, because it seems difficult to imagine how people will be able to address weight problems without recognising their weight. To answer your question, we just don't know what the effects are in children, and this is a kind of emerging field at the moment. But my perspective on it is that we should be focusing more on trying to reduce the stigma around it, reduce the distress which might be causing increased weight gain over time, and trying to tackle it from that end. And the question of whether we should be telling people what their weight is more effectively, we assumed that was the case, and the jury's a little bit out at the moment.
Thanks very much. Fascinating talk, and the parallels between obesity and psychiatric illness in terms of awareness and so on seem to be very, very striking, including the idea that, that an awareness of being mentally ill leads to depression and a loss of self-esteem in the way that obesity is. But isn't it to do with well, first of all, how the message is given, but also whether people are putting themselves at an extreme. So if a person says, yes, I'm grossly obese, it's hopeless, I might as well just eat. But if a person says, I'm somewhat overweight, or you tell them that you are somewhat overweight, there's still a lot you can do, and you can become healthy and be just as happy. Presumably that, again, you know, we're making a lot of presumptions based on common sense, but presumably that would be helpful. It is when you get to a point where you feel there's nothing I can do about it. And parallel there is also the same in mental illness. If you say you've got schizophrenia, that's it, your life's over. Why on earth would the person engage with treatment? But if you say, yes, you have some mental health problems, this is a treatment, this can really help you, you would hope that would be much more positive.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite interesting because I think the suspicion at the moment is that what makes recognition of overweight problematic is that it induces distress and hopelessness, and from that point of view, I think that it is really important to communicate what we can do, you know, how you can change your behaviours, and there were some really interesting new ideas about how to change people's behaviours as well, based on habits, based on self-regulation training, things which don't necessarily depend solely on willpower. On the subject of distress, I think that it's, for some people, even a very small amount of excess weight will be very distressing, and for other people, much less so. So, you know, it's quite hard to be clear that somebody who's only mildly overweight will have a low level of distress. I mean, as eating disorders show, you can have extremely high levels of weight distress when you're not overweight at all. So, yeah, but it's all very much an emerging topic at the moment.